Good afternoon and welcome to the third lecture of the 2025 spring season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and our 17th lecture in total. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Carlton. I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us and to my co-organizer, Adult Services Librarian Diane Dahoney, for everything she and her staff do for the lectures and the community. And many thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and hosting them on their YouTube channel, and to the State Journal for always giving us some great additional publicity. I'd like to remind everyone that you can find flyers with the full 2025 spring season of the lecture series printed in the back, and you can find the schedule on the library's website and videos of past lectures on Cable 10's YouTube channel. If you're not already but want to keep up with the lecture series, be sure to follow the library's Facebook page. And I do want to let you know about our three next lectures. On March 13th, Thursday at 6 o'clock, is Dr. Patrick Lewis, the CEO and president of the Filson Historical Society, who will present part 2 of the history of the Filson, Beyond the Founders, the Filson Historical Society and the Growth of the History Professions in Kentucky. And of course, we are extremely excited to have on March 18th at 6 o'clock, that's a Tuesday, Mr. Russ Hatter, who will be presenting on his new book, Franklin County Reference, which was just released last week. And he will have those books for sale and to sign as well. And then followed by that, on April 12th, we have Dr. David Pollock, director of the Kentucky Archaeological Survey, who will present on Frankfort's Forgotten Cemetery. There have been few people in Frankfort's history to have been passed the baton of Frankfort history and ran with it like Nicky Hughes. From Lewis Franklin Johnson and Willard Rouse Jolson to Hermina Jett Darnell, Nettie Glenn, Frank Sauer, to John Gray, Richard Taylor, Nicky Hughes, Russ Hatter, Gene Birch, Nash Cox, Bob and Sally Lanham, Jim Wallace, Jim Pritchard, Sheila Mason, Doug Boyd, and so many more, Nicky has been instrumental in shaping the modern era of Frankfort's history and preservation. After Betty Hawkinsmith Morris, wife of attorney Leslie W. Morris, sold Fort Hill to the city of Frankfort in the 1950s, it sat mostly abandoned until the 1980s, when Nicky and others took up the mantle to fulfill Betty's wishes and her contract with the city to turn it into a park bearing her husband's name and preserving the Civil War forts. It is because of Nicky's vision and perseverance that Fort Hill remains a practically untouched city park to this day. Additionally, Nicky was instrumental in converting the Old State Arsenal into the Kentucky Military History Museum in partnership with the Kentucky Historical Society and Kentucky Department for Military Affairs. He was part of the group that formed the Frankfort Heritage Press, whose efforts to gather and compile Frankfort's history led to John Gray's historic Frankfort lectures, from which this lecture series is based. The writing of Carl Kramer's 1986 Capitol on the Kentucky, the first comprehensive history of Frankfort and Franklin County, the founding of the Capital City Museum and the addition of historic sites to Frankfort's Parks and Recreation Department, the publication of several important books on Frankfort's cultural and architectural history through Frankfort Heritage Press, and much more. Whether you know it or not, you can't live in Frankfort today without having been influenced by or appreciative of Nicky's work. I know I certainly have been. So we're very glad to have him come back to Frankfort today to give this lecture. And without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Librarian Diane Dahoney to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, John. As he said, my name is Diane Dahoney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer. On behalf of everyone here at the library, I just want to thank you for coming out and sharing this beautiful afternoon with us. We are so appreciative of you, and it's nice to see some familiar faces and some faces we haven't seen in a while, so thanks for coming out. John mentioned a few of these things already, but I will go through a little bit more of a formal introduction of our speaker today. Nicky Hughes went to work for the Kentucky Historical Society in 1973. He was very active in the establishment of the Kentucky Military History Museum, which opened in '74. He served as curator of that museum until 1986 and remained with the Historical Society until 1997, acting as museum's division manager and then as curator of the Old State Capitol. He finished his time with Kentucky State Government in the Finance and Administration Cabinet's Office of Historic Properties. In 2000, Hughes joined the City of Frankfort's Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Sites. He was responsible for the establishment of the Leslie Morse Park on Fort Hill as a functional historic site and the formation of the Capital City Museum. Retiring from full-time work for the City of Frankfort in 2012, he later served as director of the Shelby County Historical Society and is now innkeeper at the Sanford Duncan Inn, a historic site in Simpson County. He's also a co-founder of Frankfort Heritage Press, where he co-authored 3 major pictorial histories of Frankfort and a history of the Frankfort Cemetery. Please help me to welcome to the podium today, Nicky Hughes.
Thank you, ma'am. Gosh, I want to meet that guy. Wow. It's nice to know I can still draw a crowd in Frankfort. Susan and I got in yesterday. My doctor is still here. We're still leaving traces of ourselves here in Frankfort, so we come up ever so often. However, I have some very important news for you. Now that we're very well settled in down in Franklin, Kentucky, south of Bowling Green, we have put our Frankfort Cemetery burial plot up for sale. Now that's making a commitment, you know? And I will tell you that it is prime real estate up there. It's about 20 feet away from where my great-great-great-grandfather's buried. And it's right beside the state plot and next to a bunch of Republican governors, but we won't go there. I was delighted to be given the opportunity to talk on this topic today. This may well be my favorite topic, the history of that building, the Old State Arsenal. And I'm probably going to prattle on about it longer than you're going to want to hear, but I'll try to keep it as amusing as possible. By the way, I thought I'd start off with something I know you have not seen, and that's this picture. That's a pretty recent watercolor by an artist in Shelbyville named Ben Ney, and he mainly does Shelby County stuff, but occasionally he comes over and does Frankfort things. And when I saw this for sale over there, I just simply had to have it. Figure out the buttons here. Oh, and Dr. Birch knows well my loving, warm, fuzzy relationship with electronic devices. This is the second computer we've gone through this morning getting set up for this. And this, of course, is the arsenal pretty much as it looks today. As I was preparing this, there are portions of it where I talk about the most recent renovation to the building. Well, it turns out that's completely out of date. It is now being renovated yet again. And that is a big part of its story. This building gets changed and modified, and its uses are revised over and over and over again. It has always been a Gothic style building. Not in the sense of flying buttresses and cathedrals, but that it hikes back to medieval architecture with the crenellations and the towers. In preparing for this, I read one account of it that said that the crenellation and all the fortifications were put on it so that it would be more easy to defend. No, it was purely the Gothic style in buildings and furnishings was extremely popular in the 1850s, in 1850 when this was built. Why was the state arsenal built? Here are 2 reasons. The U.S. Model 1816 musket and the U.S. Model 1842 musket. Simple enough, speech over. What was happening in the early 19th century, the United States had decided after the American Revolution that they simply did not want a very large army. They were going to rely upon the militia, the citizen soldiers, to be the primary defense of the country. And in order to arm those citizen soldiers, the United States government set up arsenals to manufacture firearms in their multiple thousands that were then shipped out to each state to be issued to the citizen soldiers, to the militia. And I don't know if you still have these, but there used to be some enrolled militia books in the collection of the Military Museum. And it was fascinating because they show every man, and nearly every man, had to enroll in the enrolled militia and be subject to call up to defend the country. And they put their name, their street address, and what guns they owned. They were registering firearms in the first half of the 19th century in order for that well-regulated militia that the Second Amendment talks about. That's what they were doing. Then the people who didn't have their own weapons, they were issuing these government-manufactured weapons, and they had to have a place to store them until they went out into the communities. And that is the primary reason that the state arsenal was built here in Frankfort. Their customers were these fine fellows, the enrolled militia. The enrolled militia earned a terrible reputation, well-deserved. They were supposed to meet regularly. It was mandatory. You must go to the militia muster. And the men involved pretty soon figured out, well, yeah, I gotta go, but it doesn't mean I have to do anything. The military training was very minimal, and probably the most popular and most vigorously pursued endeavor was the consumption of alcoholic beverages. They didn't learn a whole lot about tactics, which was very complicated back then. The drinking component became more and more and more important as the years went by, it seems, and appropriately here in Kentucky. And it became a tradition with the Kentucky Militia that at the conclusion of a militia encampment, they would bury a bottle of whiskey in the property where they'd hold the encampment. And oh Lord, how I'd love to find one of those. The arsenal was built in 1850. The smaller flanker building there were originally two earlier gun houses, arsenals, behind that flanker building. That would be in the, that corner, northeast corner of the old Capitol lot. One was built in 1820 and one in 1834. The one that was built in 1820 was torn down to provide material for the second one, and the second one burned, apparently rather spectacularly. And the state, in its wisdom, decided to build a new state arsenal, and this was, you can say architect, you can say builder. There were a lot of fellows building things in Kentucky back then who were both architects and builders. And this is the guy who designed and was responsible for the construction of the state arsenal, Nathaniel C. Cook. He was a very prolific architect or builder and was responsible for lots of things in this part of Kentucky. He did a couple of houses that you can see here for the Brown family, particularly for Orlando Brown Jr. This one on my left, out at Blue Wing Landing. Delightful little house. It was operated as a B&B for several years. I don't think they do that anymore. And then the other one is out in Thornhill. Get yourself oriented you're looking at downtown Frankfort from South Frankfort. And the legislature originally decreed in the authorization for building the new arsenal building that it had to be at least 1/2 mile away from the state capitol. Did they actually follow through on that? as many times as I walked from the old Capitol up there, I kept thinking, you know, you got to measure this someday, but I never did. So I don't know if they ever if it actually is or not. But that was the idea, primarily because of that spectacular fire. They didn't want that happening again in close proximity to the State House. The building was built, it and the railroad tunnel were almost contemporary, and you end up with the State Arsenal building sitting on top of a railroad tunnel, which kind of seems a little peculiar, but you know, it has worked since 1850, so I guess it's all right. When I used to work up there late at night, you would hear the trains go through, rumbling through. And in order to build a building where they wanted it, on that promontory overlooking downtown, very dramatic site, they had to relocate the road headed up the hill out that way too. So it was quite a project. Yeah. They had to, like I said, they had to displace the road to the other side of the building. And this is how it looked fairly early, plain brick. But the poor building changes colors with some regularity over the years. It went through a gray and a white phase in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The cannon in that shot over there was a souvenir of the Spanish-American War. It was a very, very old gun that was taken off of one of the Spanish forts in Puerto Rico. The 1st Kentucky Infantry had done a little souvenir hunting down there, I think. And for quite a while, it was gleaming white. And see the buildings, the houses on the back there. Anybody remember those houses? This building actually was in a residential neighborhood for a long, long, long time. If old-time Frankfort folks will remember that on the other side of East Main Street, there was a whole neighborhood went down through there. And actually right across the street, they ended, there were houses right directly across East Main Street from the Arsenal. And then there were 2 more houses behind, or where the parking lot is now, basically. But those were demolished to put in the parking lot. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. And then there was an adjutant general who will remain nameless, who had a great affection for green paint. And apparently he painted nearly every structure belonging to the Kentucky National Guard a brilliant bright green, including the State Arsenal. And this is how I first remember seeing it. When I, in my youthful silliness, moved to this part of the state to go to UK law school, I remember driving by this green Arsenal building and thinking, well, that's just a delightful building. I wonder what's in there. It's got to be fascinating. And everybody always told me there's nothing in there. So, but it was painted the brilliant green. More on that in a minute. This is the most famous painting of the building, Paul Sawyer's. And I always cursed dear Paul for this particular painting because he featured a part of the building that hasn't been there in a long, 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 long time. That little brick extension out the back, I think, was probably associated with the ammunition manufacturing facility they put in during the Civil War. And it's somewhat, do you know when it was torn down? That back wing? I've never known. But Paul didn't do us any big favors with the angle of the picture here. This is a plaque commemorating one of those many renovations over the years. I'm not sure, am I doing that? Oh, okay. It's cannon fire in the distance. One reason I wanted to show you this picture is not so much the 1916 renovation, whatever it was they did that year, but the brick. And here I have to confess to sin. In 1973, if you wanted to get green paint off an old brick building, you sandblasted it. We did. The building has never quite recovered from that. We now know that, well, you can see what the sandblasting, how the damage it did to the building. And in what's now the next to the last major renovation, they assure me that they fixed that. Did they? We don't know yet. But this is an illustration of how state government has changed since 1973 when I started there. I was in my office in the Arsenal one day, and the sandblasting guys were, and I had slowed them down from how they started off. It was really destructive when they started. They were busily working outside the building, and the Environmental Protection Agency people showed up and said, you have to stop doing this because all the sand is polluting the air. And again, this is how state government has changed so much. The chain of command for me was me, my boss was Colonel George Chin, and he answered to Wendell H. Ford, the governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I called up Colonel Chin and said, we have a problem with the sandblasting. He called Governor Ford, said, we have a problem with the sandblasting. The EPA guys disappeared and never showed up again. But what a chain of command, you know? It was so easy to get things done, even if they might not have been something we really wanted to get done. There have been 1 million artists' renderings of this building. It was drawn by Robert Powell, who was a very popular artist in this part of Kentucky for a while. This shot shows it pretty much as it was when I got there in 73 and 74. The most historically significant thing here is the flagpole on the roof. That was how it was built. And the horrible thing that we really hated at the time was that the electric lines from this side of the river to South Frankfort went right across the front lawn of the old state arsenal. And that was just wasn't attractive at all. And General Freimeyer, who was the adjutant general at that point, had pull enough to get that finally taken away. And you see the two people standing in front of the door down there? Those are my parents, who had come up to see me at this great project I was working on. The flagpole was removed from the roof and placed in a little concrete anchor in the front of the building. I never thought that was particularly successful, but why the National Guard insisted on moving it was, over the years, as the wind had moved that flagpole back and forth, it had opened up a space around it, and the roof was leaking. And they wanted that to stop. So that's what they did. And this is the way it looked when it was up there. Now, this is one of several times in which we almost lost this building. The construction workers who had cutting torches up on the roof, cut that metal flagpole. 4:30, we gotta go. They said, well, we can't leave this hole where the hot cut-off pole was overnight, so they just put a piece of plywood over it, and everybody left. Of course, the piece of plywood caught fire. It was very obvious from the street, apparently. I was in Lexington at the time. And they called the fire department, and the fire chief told me later that when he came around onto the Capitol Avenue Bridge in the fire truck, the amount of fire and smoke that he could see on the top of that building, his thought was, we have lost the state arsenal. It is gone. And he was delighted when he got here and found out it was just a piece of plywood burning vigorously up on the roof. So they put the fire out, and the building survived, not for the first or last time. Oh, and by the way, getting up there to raise and lower the flag was a stimulating experience for an acrophobic like me. There was a very old rickety ladder, went up one of those towers. And when you got to the top of the tower, you had to step way over the chasm to get out onto the roof. I didn't enjoy that. You've been up there, haven't you, Doctor? Great fun. They don't have to worry about that anymore. But in 1933, there was a vastly more serious fire. There were lots of supplies stored in there, a lot of stuff left over from the First World War. Something started a very serious fire, and we almost lost it. It did a great deal of damage to the interior of the building, mainly upstairs and toward the back. But when you went up that ladder up into the tower to go to the roof, you could still see charred boards in there. And the arsenal, of course, is very conveniently located to the state penitentiary, so they actually brought inmates from the penitentiary up to help fight the fire and take material out of the building. I was going to say this was the most recent renovation. It isn't. This is now the second most recent renovation. This was a very major project was done, we think around 2007. And the one thing I wanted to show you here, the plaque between the two towers at the top, the State Arsenal, 1850, the same people made that make all the state historical highway markers. So it was colored and painted the same way. And it was really funny. The National Guard guys who were responsible for the renovation in the early 70s, there's always been a recess between those two towers where the sign over the generations said State Arsenal, 1850, whatever. But the National Guard guys very, very, very carefully measured that recess and then ordered the plaque to put in there. And of course it comes in, guess what? Didn't fit, too big. There was much embarrassment, but they chipped some of the brick away so they could get it squeezed in there. And again, those people will remain nameless. This is pretty much as it appears today. The big change in that now next to last renovation was making the major entrance in the side, through that side door. That was always a great, huge door that when it was a functional arsenal and supplies and weapons and all sorts of stuff were constantly coming in and out, was absolutely essential. And you can see on the back was an extension that was built sometime in the middle of the 20th century. And it was originally the garage for the civil defense vehicles. The state civil defense offices were in here for quite a while. Some people we're not going to mention. Well, this guy gets a mention. This is the late, great Scott Walters, who was deeply involved in that 2007 renovation of the arsenal. And we miss Scott a whole bunch. I know a lot of you people in here knew him real well. And this guy, Tom Fugate, who was my replacement or my successor when I left the Military History Museum. And I just did a fabulous job with it. And he's vividly illustrating one of the ongoing problems with the way that building is built. Snow, ice, water builds up behind those crenellations and then leaks into the building. So every time there was a heavy snow, you could count on good old Tom Fugate would be up there on the roof tossing the ice and snow off the side. And he'd try to get me to do it, and I'd tell him where he could put his ice and snow. A fairly recent shot at night, and I've stolen some things offline, and Dr. Birch, you know how that happens sometimes. You never know if the real owner is going to be in the audience, so it could happen here. When we first reopened it back in the early 70s, we wanted dramatic lighting on the building because it is just a dramatic sight. So we put this great huge box of lights, would have been, see where that shrubbery is over there? About like that. And the lighting consultants told it needed to be lit at an angle. So that's how it did. And it really looked great. There were nice shadows on the front of the building. Remember I told you about those houses that were on the other side of the street? They loved to sit on their front porch, and then suddenly, boom, this blinding light. So that setup didn't last much, and the lighting was moved around to the front, which is where it has been more or less ever since. This is one of the most influential individuals in the history of the state arsenal. He was never there, probably never knew of his existence, but do you know who he is? John Brown, who did the slave insurrection, wanted to lead the slave insurrection, and led the attack on the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry. That episode scared the wazoo out of everybody south of the Ohio River. And it generated a resurgence in the militia, only this time around they weren't going to rely so much on the enrolled militia who were out getting drunk, but there was a new version of the militia really, and it had been around for a long time, but it really took off, the volunteer militia. These were gentlemen who wanted to have military service without being in the regular army. And they formed militia companies all across the country. And they really took off after Mr. Brown conducted his raid on Harper's Ferry. I forget what that one is. We'll move on. These were the customers for the arsenal in the era, or during the secession crisis and early in the Civil War. This is the encampment of the Kentucky State Guard at what used to be the fairgrounds in Louisville, Camp Boone, they called it, in 1860. And you can see these guys were serious about this stuff. Just about every company had its own, sometimes very distinctive uniforms. And they worked real hard at learning the drill and looking and acting soldierly. I'm sure they still drank the whiskey when the opportunity was. But it's a really interesting picture if you look very closely. The very tall, this guy in a U.S. Army general's uniform, who was the official U.S. Army inspector, is General Albert Sidney Johnston. That rings a bell with the Civil War buffs, doesn't it? His uniform would change color in a few months. And this bearded, sort of pudgy fellow is John Hunt Morgan. And we picture him as, you know, the slim, trim thunderbolt of the Confederacy. Yes, yeah. He is wearing a bearskin. The Louisville Citizen Guards had bearskin hats. The whole companies did. It was pretty colorful bunch. But that's who the arsenal was serving at the beginning of the Civil War. We're getting weapons and ammunition to those people. This was the staff of the State Guard. These guys, especially the quartermasters and supply people, would have been in and out of the arsenal all the time. The fellow in the center is Simon Bolivar Buckner. He was the Inspector General, commander of the Kentucky State Guard during the secession crisis. He would go on to a very long, colorful career with the Confederate Army, and he would ultimately be governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He would become the pattern for the Kentucky colonel after the war. You know, in the white linen suit and the straw hat. And, this was the guy who really popularized that. He was brilliant. As he got old, probably about my age, he started going blind, knew what was happening. He memorized several Shakespeare plays. He said, so I can read in the dark. Pretty sharp character. But he would have been in and out of the arsenal with some frequency. He was also responsible for updating a lot of the guns that were stored in the arsenal. Those 1816, 1842 muskets were smoothbore muskets. He had a lot of them rifled, spiral grooves cut in the interior of the barrels, which very much increased the accuracy of those weapons. Things got very ugly in this town and incredibly confused. I know you've had the Civil War in Frankfort talk, incredibly complicated political situation. Part of the problem was this gentleman, Governor Beriah Begotten, if he could have found a legal way to take Kentucky out of the Union, he would have done so. But he was very much a stickler for the rules, and the rules at that point, all the lawyers agree for a state to secede from the Union, it has to be done by the state legislature or a convention appointed by the state legislature, and he could never make that happen. But the pro-Union folks in Kentucky state government slowly pulled the rug out from under him, and they organized something called the State Military Board, to which they gave all the authority to run the state guard, the militia. Once the war cranked up, the arsenal was, for a while, a very busy place and an active participant as an arsenal. They were manufacturing ammunition in it. It was a pretty complicated process. It was a dangerous process, and for parts of it, it was almost always, at all these arsenals all across the country, done by women. Because, as you're going to see in a minute, to make these cartridges, you had to work with thread to tie them, and women were considered to be the experts in doing that sort of work. There is a document at the Historical Society that's the payroll for these women at the arsenal. They're nearly all Irish, and they are names that, remember back when we had phone books, if you looked through a Frankfort phone book, you would have recognized a lot of the names of those ladies. Now, the actual filling of the cartridges with the gunpowder was significantly more dangerous, and therefore it was considered to be man's work. And there were facilities just about, I'm sure, as portrayed in these pictures at the arsenal. They made at least two kinds of cartridges. This part was filled with black gunpowder, and then the bullet was that part up there. And it was all wrapped in paper and tied up with a thread at the tip. This was what they call ball cartridge. They also made a buck and ball cartridges, which was a round bullet with three small bullets on top of it that just enhanced your chances of hitting somebody if you shot at them. And we know they made both types of those at the arsenal. And these are what the original ones looked like. And they manufactured these things by the thousands. Then they were bundled into paper cartridges, paper packs of 10 cartridges each. And there's some of the tools they used to make these things, little sticks that you rolled the paper up on. Then they packed them into crates like this for shipment out to the armies. And they always said on the end of them what they were. I found in the records where they had paid somebody for the stencil to stencil the ammunition crates with. And I would sit at my desk trying to figure, okay, what could they say that would fit? They charged by the letter. I said, well, it would fit that set of letters because we wanted to make some reproductions of this. Never could figure out what they were making that matched the letters in that contract. Now, they had to have temporary storage for those crates full of ammunition, which were inherently dangerous. So they dug a bunker built a bunker. This is the Frankfort Cemetery. This is the East Main Street entrance, and the bunker was somewhere in this vicinity out here. Now, when I discovered that, I proposed, well, there's the greatest archaeology project that's ever going to be in Frankfort, Kentucky. We got to go find that bunker. Well, I was quickly informed by cemetery management that that was not going to happen. The only thing they wanted dug up there was graves, so we were never able to do that. And now there have been quite a number. Then that was unoccupied. Now there have been quite a number of graves put in that area, and I don't think we'll ever find the location of that facility. From 1861 on, these gentlemen, Kentucky volunteers for the Union Army, were the primary customers of the Old State Arsenal. These are the guys that were getting that ammunition. And also there are records, believe it or not, this was the regulation hat for the Union Army in the Civil War. And there are records of some of those being there, but also boxes of the little letters and bugle insignia, regimental numbers, the hat cords, and even the feathers. Boxes of dress hat feathers stored in there. And of course, there were guns. Kentucky purchased a lot of firearms on its own issued to Kentucky soldiers during the war. This is a Ballard rifle. This is modern high-tech stuff. It was single shot, breech loader, cartridge gun, and completely a new generation from those muskets we started off talking about. The ones that came here were all stamped with Kentucky on top of the barrel. And Ball and Williams was the company in Massachusetts that manufactured them. Should you find one of these that is stamped Kentucky, my number is 502-682. I will answer that phone call. And they did some really innovative stuff here. And part of the problem with Kentucky, they had to be innovators because we were so late in going over to and supporting the Union side that the northern states had already bought up most of the good guns and uniforms and equipment. So it meant Kentucky had to innovate. And one of the innovations was this, the Mann's patent cartridge box. The one on the far side is a conventional Civil War era ammunition cartridge box. Those paper cartridges we were just looking at fit in there, and it was carried right here, and you reached down and got one, ripped it open, loaded, and fired. They bought a lot of the Mann's patent box, whole big new deal, in that it suspended the ammunition box right in front. Nobody had much done that before, and Kentucky bought a bunch of these things, and they passed through the Army on the way to Union, huh?
What if a bullet hits that?
It'll be bad. My wife has been trained to know that every good Kentuckian hisses at the mention of the name of General Braxton Bragg. Come on. Union supporting Kentuckians hated Braxton Bragg because he was a Confederate general. Confederate Kentuckians hated him because the Confederate troops under his command despised the man. They thought that he had probably tried to kill them more often than not. John C. Breckinridge, originally early on the commander of the Orphan Brigade, one of the main Kentucky infantry unit, said that if he could have gotten away with shooting Braxton Bragg, he would have done it, but he never had the opportunity. Anyway, these two gentlemen supervised things when the arsenal actually came under fire, or downtown Frankfort did, when they conducted the 1862 campaign into Kentucky that would culminate in the Battle of Perryville. And what they did here in town was inaugurated Richard Hawes, which was the second, installed, he'd already been sworn in, as the Confederate governor of Kentucky. And didn't last long, they evacuated very shortly, and you've probably already had that lecture, so we won't go into great depth on it. But why it's relevant here is while they were in Frankfort, of course the Confederates went into the state arsenal, cleaned out everything that they wanted of use to them. It's interesting, they dumped some of this stuff as they were, some of the older weapons, as they were retreating out of Kentucky at the end of the Perryville campaign. They just tossed some of the stuff that was antiquated by the side of the road, apparently. This is another extremely innovative, interesting weapon that the Commonwealth purchased. It's the Triplet and Scott. They came both as carbines and full-length rifles. And it is a truly unique design. It's a magazine-fed, breech-loading cartridge rifle. The magazine is a tube that runs down all the way the length of the stock. And there's a little hatchway in the butt of the stock you can open up to put the cartridges in and seal it back up. When you want to shoot it, you cock the hammer, hit this little lever here, and this block rotates to match up with that tube coming out of the stock. A spring throws a cartridge into that breech, you twist it back, and you're good to go. Worked fine. Kentucky was one of the few states to purchase them. The ones that were bought by Kentucky are stamped on the side of the breech, Kentucky. They arrived here in June of 1865. What's the problem? The war ended in April of 1865. There was another problem. They came in by railroad car to the depot, different building then, but down below the arsenal. And as they were bringing them up the arsenal and unloading them, they noticed that a whole lot of them, the small of the stock here through which that feeder magazine tube full of bullets ran, were cracked. And it was just, there wasn't enough wood there to do what had to hold the gun together and still be functional. Now, the Triplet and Scott weapons created some serious problems because obviously the Commonwealth officials were unhappy that the stocks were cracked. And the federal government, when they got the bill, the feds had said, we'll pay for any weapons the states buy to be used in defense of the Union. The feds came back, you didn't use these in defense of the Union, we ain't paying for them. This stayed in court for about 30 years, which brings us to this. You're saying, you're not talking about the Capitol today, Nicky, you're confused, you're talking about the arsenal. That lawsuit in which the Commonwealth of Kentucky sued the feds to recover the money we had spent for those rifles and lots of other things, went on for years. Ultimately, we won. The feds wrote a check for $2 million, and that's what they spent it on. So the new Capitol has a very intimate, important relationship to the Civil War, and rather indirectly to the arsenal. Back to John Hunt Morgan, the thunderbolt of the Confederacy. He's the fella who really brought the arsenal, or his soldiers, he wasn't here, his soldiers brought the arsenal under hostile fire for the only time I'm aware of, in June of 1864 when they attacked Frankfort. You want me to? Sure. Okay. Well, I'm running sort of short of time, should have... Anyway, Susan wants me to sing, and I assure this is the only time in the presentation I will do so. At that time, everybody loved to write parodies of the other guys' songs, and there was a parody written of the great Southern anthem, Maryland, My Maryland. And and Union people wrote this, and it was about John Hunt Morgan. And it goes, John Morgan's foot is on thy shore, Kentucky, oh Kentucky. His hand is on your stable door, Kentucky, oh Kentucky. You'll see your good gray mare no more. He'll ride her till her back is sore and leave her at some stranger's door, Kentucky, oh Kentucky. Anyway, Morgan had an earlier association with the Arsenal when he was a Kentucky State Guard company commander. There's a nifty little piece of paper with his autograph on it where he was issued 40 of these 1840 rifles. And there's a famous episode where he loaded these in the bottom of a wagon and sneaked them out of Lexington when his troops went south to join the Confederate Army. And they had been issued to him out of the state arsenal here. And again, this is the only time the arsenal came under hostile fire. The Confederates had marksmen right over there on that side of the river. The Union defenders of Kentucky had rolled a cannon into the front lawn of the arsenal and were banging away at the Confederates in South Frankfort, along with the guns at Fort Hill. Until one of the marksmen, Confederates on the other side of the river over there, put a mini ball bullet right through the gun crew. They retired to the interior of the arsenal and were not seen or heard from again. The Confederates also made an attack trying to come down through the cemetery to seize the arsenal from the backside. And again, that got, the artillery at Fort Hill put a stop to that. And that's the view from Fort Hill at that vintage you would have gotten of the state arsenal, looking across the state penitentiary. There's a great set of records that document that attack, and I still have access to a few of these. This one is for whiskey for the hospital and workers at Fort Boone during the 1864 attack. And apparently providing whiskey to all these laborers was extremely important because there's a lot of these records like this. This one, they're carrying artillery from the arsenal, probably from that bunker in the cemetery, up to Fort Hill, Fort Boone. This one is for whiskey to be given to the drivers of the wagons carrying the ammunition to the fort. Now, is this a good plan? And let's just say this eventually would backfire. I was sitting in my office at the Arsenal one day. I get a call from the Kentucky State Police Post out on Shelbyville Road, and they say some people are excavating for a new building across the road from our office, from the barracks out there, and they think they found some cannonballs. Would you come take a look? Well, sure. So I went out and I walk up, and here's a backhoe and piles of dirt everywhere and dirt in the shovel of the backhoe. And I'm looking around and I'm standing in the middle of dozens of these 10-pound Parrott rifle shells, live, fused, ready to go. And I just backed up. Basically said, boys, this is way above my pay grade. And they eventually, unfortunately, they called the ordnance demolition people from Fort Knox, who came over and took them to a range on Fort Knox and blew up every single one of these. And why I was so frustrated was we later found a newspaper account where at the end of the Civil War, there were dozens, hundreds, I guess, of these things in the arsenal. In order to get rid of them, they contracted with a private individual here in Frankfort to load them on wagons, take them out to that site, take the gunpowder out of them. They were then going to sell the gunpowder, and end of story. Well, one of those wagons, as it went up Louisville Road, boom, exploded. too bad for the driver, the mules pulling it, and they canceled the project and immediately threw all these shells in a hole and buried them, forgotten, until the guys running the excavator that day dug them up. But that would have been a primary arsenal artifact from the Civil War, but the Army just didn't want to fool with taking the risk of defusing them. Oh, let's see, we'll skip some of this. After the Civil War, this was the arsenal's customers. It was still called the Kentucky State Guard until 1912 and became the Kentucky National Guard. And the arsenal sent supplies to troops like this who were keeping the peace in the various civil disturbances in Kentucky in the late 1800s, pretty much in support of pretty conservative causes in those days. The arsenal also handled supplies going to troops in the Spanish-American War and on the Mexican border in 1916.
Was that Bloody Breath?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. I think I'm not supposed to show pictures from your storage space, but I am. This is a Hotchkiss cannon that belonged to the Kentucky State Guard in the late 19th and early 20th century, was at the arsenal for a long, long, long time, first as a functional weapon and then as a museum piece. And it was used, along with several other guns over the years, for firing salutes from the lawn of the arsenal. It used to be the first act passed by the state legislature every session was specifying which holidays would be marked by cannon salutes by the State Guard. And they had always said that they would fire one shot for every state in the Union except West Virginia. By this time, the Bourbon Democrats, the surviving Confederates, who had been the big heroes in Kentucky after the Civil War, were running things, and they didn't think West Virginia had a constitutional right to exist. And they passed the rule, say you will not fire a shot for West Virginia. And some of these old codgers would show up and count, just to be sure. And one year, sure enough, the nice young lieutenant in command of the gun crew, he's banging away, and they get to the end of the salute, and he had fired shots for every state in the Union, including West Virginia, apparently. So the old Bourbon Democrats run up to him and says, "How dare you? Why did you do that? You know better than that." And the sharp young lieutenant said, "No, sir, I did not fire a shot for West Virginia. I fired one extra for Virginia, mother of states, in the Old Dominion." They said, "Oh, okay, that's fine." For a while, the state arsenal was the headquarters of the Kentucky Highway Patrol after the Second World War. Also served the state active militia, which were the troops that were raised to replace the National Guard when they got called up in the Second World War. For many years, it was the headquarters and workshop and storage for the civil defense in Kentucky. And there was still some of this stuff in the building when I got there. In fact, do you remember these drums of fallout shelter supplies? They were great. They had water and food and all sorts of good stuff in them, and a little plastic ring, you could put it on the top and convert it into a toilet. When they were getting rid of these, when we were clearing out to make exhibits, somebody who had a farm claimed all the little crackers that were in them, took them to his farm, dumped them out to feed his pigs. They wouldn't touch it. By the early 1970s, the history of the arsenal was getting ready to change. The Kentucky Historical Society had its exhibits in the old state capitol, and they were going to completely redo the old state capitol, take it back much more to how it looked when it was first built, and build a new museum of general Kentucky history next door in the old Capitol Annex. Meanwhile, the Kentucky National Guard had built all sorts of new facilities at Boone National Guard Center. And they didn't really have any use for the arsenal anymore. So some smart people got together. And if there is a father of the Kentucky Military History Museum, a very good candidate is this gentleman, General Richard Freimeyer. At that time, he was the Adjutant General of Kentucky, the head of the Department of Military Affairs, head of Kentucky National Guard. He was also the first blue suit Adjutant General, the first Air Force officer to be promoted to Adjutant General. And it helps know he was a real good friend of Wendell Ford. But he is probably the guy who first came up with the idea, the National Guard's got a building, Historical Society's got a military collection that no longer has a home. Let's put them together. And that's what happened. They brought in this fellow, William Robards Buster, was a retired deputy adjutant general and one of the greatest people I ever met. And he had been brought on board at the Historical Society to help manage, long story, won't go there, the renovation of the old state capitol. And he got deeply involved with the creation of the Military History Museum. Really made it. His coordination between the Historical Society and the National Guard really made the whole project possible. And then this fellow, George Morgan Chin, who was one of the world's experts on weapons, armament, especially automatic weapon, who just happened to be the director of the Kentucky Historical Society at that time. So he was a huge influence and a huge help in getting that museum going. Now, this is a good time as any to confess that sometimes Colonel Chin and I did not see eye to eye, and Colonel Chin was a rather stubborn individual. And we had different concepts of what the Kentucky Military History Museum should be. Colonel Chin saw it as a military history museum in Kentucky. I saw it as a military history museum about Kentucky. Now, there's not a lot of word difference there, but it could result in a very, very different institution. So we fought that fight for a while. I won. Here are a couple of people. If you talk about the history of this building and that institution, you have to mention the elderly gentleman over there is Colonel Armando Alfaro. His father had fought with Pancho Villa in 1916, and he was the National Guard's recruiting and retention officer when we got started in this, and General Freimeyer made him the liaison with the museum. And he did everything he could possibly do to facilitate getting that institution going. And that's his wife, Dorothy, who on opening morning, February 1974, the place was still a mess, sawdust, litter everywhere. Dorothy and full bird Colonel Alfaro were the ones who took the mops and the brooms and cleaned the place up and had it ready for when the governor came over to cut the ribbon. Ramona Slattery, some of you will remember her. She was a great genealogist. Her office was in the arsenal as we were making the conversion into the museum. She worked for Civil Defense. You all know Chuck Bogard. She was his secretary. And for a while, we were building exhibits around their desk before they could be moved out. Lots of other people involved in it. I've got to talk about Norman Lawson. Any of you remember Norman? The guy in the middle firing the weapon there? I was sitting at my desk in the lobby of the arsenal. He walks in one day. I'd never seen him before. And Norman was rather distinctive in appearance. His width and height were pretty closely matched. And he comes in and I said, "Hello, I'm Nicky Hughes. What can I do for you?" And he just smiled and said, "No. It's the other way around." At which point my education in firearms began. He knew as much as could be known about firearms at that point. And he filled my brain with that. Bob Kennard, with General Buster there, was director of the Historical Society after the general and was extremely supportive. Dave Schultz was brought in by Colonel Chen. He'd been the curator at the Marine Corps Museum just to make sure us young kids didn't screw things up. And then Bill Cheshire, whose father had been an extremely important officer in the National Guard through most of the 20th century and was just in love with the project, did everything he could to make it happen. This was the original staff. The gentleman on the right is Mike Hausch. The ladies are, well, Eugenia Blackburn is the one on the left. That's Crit's mother. She had been a tour guide and museum curator at the old state capitol. So when they shut that down, she came up with us. And, oh, the lady in the middle. Yeah, Thelma Cheek. I had been her helper at the old capitol, and they started off. And Thelma Cheek, I have to tell you, is the greatest baker in the history of the planet. And she kept the staff at the arsenal very happy for quite a long time. Phil Slattery, Ramona's son, was one of our first tour guides. And here's me doing something you probably will never see done again. We did a lot of field work, and here I am doing a classroom demonstration. And yes, there's everything from a Revolutionary War musket to a Thompson submachine gun and an M16 rifle that's in this classroom. You don't get to do those anymore. Opening day, 18th of February, 1974, Wendell Ford, who had been a huge supporter, came and made the opening remarks. See the silly-looking kid on the corner down there with a bow tie? That's me. There was a downside to the opening. One of our friends wanted to fire his saluting cannon, which he did, and it exploded, and he was pretty badly injured. But other than that, it was well, it was still a very memorable day. The early exhibits. Some things are still there. These are some of the early exhibits we did. One thing that I tried to do is when we started off, we had an enormous gun collection. That wasn't a problem. From the very beginning, I tried to show the other stuff, the uniforms, the equipment, the pictures, et cetera, et cetera. That was the flag of the 6th Kentucky Infantry Regiment. It turns out my great-great-great uncle was in that. And here's a story. When they, at some point in the history of the old Capitol, the United Daughters of the Confederacy were made responsible for all the Civil War flags. The Union flags, they rolled up in newspapers and tossed in the basement of the old Capitol Annex. The Confederate flags, they paid a fortune to have them treated in this plastic preservative, which immediately started to deteriorate. The colors were completely distorted by that, and over the years, that plastic coating has just slowly been coming apart. This is one of our early exhibits. As far as I know, this was the first exhibit about slavery that the Kentucky Historical Society ever did. We stressed the National Guard, of course, because they were putting the roof over our heads. And this was always one of my favorite items. And I'm running out of time, but I got to tell you this one. A colonel in the U.S. Army from Harrodsburg was one of the first people who got to the Landsberg prison in Germany toward the end of the war. And that's where this plaque was, and it was the cell that the Weimar government had imprisoned Adolf Hitler in after his initial try to take over the German government. They put this plaque up, and this colonel from Kentucky comes in, see this is the greatest war souvenir in all history, pulled it off, had it shipped home, and eventually his family gave it to the Historical Society. And the intriguing thing is it came with a letter. It's a letter from that colonel, I think to his mother, said that he was sending the plaque out of Hitler's cell and a German flag that was there with it. We now know that the flag that was in this cell was the Blutfahne. That is the flag that had been spattered with blood during the beer hall putsch, and was the flag that Hitler carried around when he would consecrate other flags and touch with it. And it is distinctly possible that the Blutfahne is in your collection. Tom Fugate and I always wanted to get a lot of good photos, and there's lots of newsreel film of that flag, and then compare it to all the Nazi flags in our collection, but we never got that done. It's an intriguing possibility. As to flags, this is obviously a Japanese one. Mike House, the fellow I showed you before, he always had the most fun tours. He was taking a Japanese group one day. They see this flag, and they just, a great lot of chatter back and forth, a little cluster, really going about this flag. And Japanese always loved our Japanese exhibit because it was illegal to display all this World War II stuff in Japan. And so Mike asked them, okay, what's so special about this flag? And they talk back and forth. Finally, their spokesman says, the nicest thing it says is screw Roosevelt. And we later had it translated, and by golly, that was the nicest thing it said. Another one of the early exhibits, we got a lot of stuff. The Vietnam War was just winding down, and the National Guard provided much to us. We tried to keep up with the Navy, the history of the Kentucky's association with the Navy, and Chuck Bogart was very instrumental in that. And here's where I'm going to preach. I sang before, now I'm going to preach. This was the silver service to the battleship Kentucky as displayed in the Kentucky Military History Museum in the Arsenal in the 1970s. At some point, a certain governor, who will remain nameless, he's dead now, decided that needed to go to the governor's mansion. We objected most vigorously to that because by this time we knew enough about taking care of historic objects to know that you just simply can't keep polishing historic silver. You take away a layer of the silver every time you do that. So we insisted its best use was to be exhibited at the Kentucky Military History Museum. The governor disagreed. The governor even wrote in his book about this episode, by the way. And the adjutant general, of course, agreed with the governor. And he said, a truck will be here Monday and we'll take the silver, which is what happened. And it's wandered around the Historical Society in various places in Frankfort ever since. But here's a secret. As that meeting was breaking up, Tom Fugate, who was the curator, he'd already succeeded me, was griping about it to the adjutant general in the then much smaller parking lot beside the Arsenal. And the adjutant general said, tell you what, you guys let the silver go quietly. We'll tear down those buildings and expand your parking lot by 3 times. Tom was smart enough to say, yes, sir. That's how things get done in this town sometimes. Oh, and I tried to get the Navy, who still owns it, to help me out in keeping it in the museum, and I got in touch with the guy who's responsible for it. I found out it has nothing to do with the Navy's history and museum folks. The same people who issue blankets and ammunition and paint are responsible for this. And he just told me, he said, if you think I'm going to get in an argument with the governor of Commonwealth, Kentucky, you are crazy. And that ended it. Air Guard exhibit early on. Look at that kid. Yes, that's me. You didn't have to say, wow. The National Guard did a lot of good stuff for us in those days, and I'm sure they still do, including designing and publishing a lot of our early publicity. But an endless source of confusion. This, of course, can be called the Frankfort Arsenal. This is the Frankfort Arsenal, which is outside Philadelphia. And it was still a functional arsenal producing weapons for the United States military and doing all sorts of research and everything when we were setting the museum up. And I would get phone calls from guys saying, I want to apply for that precision welding job you got. And, no, it's the other one. And this went on, we didn't think much about it until I got an invoice one day, said your 50 cases of 50 caliber machine gun ammunition have been shipped. And no, we gotta clear this up. And shortly thereafter, the Frankfort arsenal closed and eliminated that little problem for us. Have to always say what a great job that fella did, Tom Fugate, who was my successor. He then went on, one reason he was so helpful, to work for the Heritage Council, preserving Civil War and other military heritage sites in Kentucky. And he had a great, during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, he had a direct phone line to Kentucky troops in the field. And he would say, I want and tell them what kind of weapon it was. They'd go get it. And then they boxed all that stuff and brought it back, and it's now in the collection there. They tried to bring home a T-72 tank, Iraqi tank, and they found one that was running, and they went out in the desert and got it and were driving it back to wherever their base was, and an American A-10 fighter plane just whoosh right over them. Boop, they hopped out, walked back to the camp, said, no, this is way too dangerous. I'm way out of time, but I just wanted to show that cliff there. There was a horrible episode where we used to have a big oil tank, and it was heated with an oil burner. And an oil delivery truck came one day, and he had to make 2 deliveries, one to the state arsenal, one to the state armory, which is out at the National Guard Center. State armory has a vastly bigger storage tank. He was confused, pumped their order into ours, which was at the top of this cliff. And before long, people at Jim's Seafood noticed an oil slick coming down the river. And it was the oil from the arsenal that had come out the top of our much too small storage tank, gone all the way down that cliff and into the river. That day, the EPA came and they didn't go away. That's how it looked in the mid-'70s for most of the time when I was there. And you can see the light fixture has moved. Oh yeah, I gotta say about that beautiful, you remember that beautiful, gorgeous tree that used to stand there? That vicious, awful, terrible, subhuman Tom Fugate killed that beautiful, wonderful tree. I'll never forgive him. Actually, it was dead and had to go, but I love to torment him about it. Recent shot at night, it's looking pretty good. And look at that kid. And I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to the taxpayers of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and to the citizens of Frankfort for letting me have a time in that building, because it was an extremely enjoyable and I think a pretty darn productive thing to have been able to do. And there you have it. By my count, I've now gone 10 minutes into my Q&A time, so good for me.
Who wants to start us out? I'm going to bring the mic to you so they can hear you on TV if you have a question or comment. Now, y'all aren't usually bashful, so.
I did it all, got it all on the first try.
Okay.
I'm just curious, Simon Buckner, was he buried in the Frankfort Cemetery?
Yes.
I thought so, okay.
There are 2 Simon Buckners in the Frankfort
Yeah, it was
Cemetery.
Simon.
And this is Simon Sr. and Simon Bolivar Jr.
Okay. I thought I had, that was correct.
Yeah. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. had the unwanted distinction of being the highest ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the Second World War. You don't want that one.
Is there anyone else? Question, comment? Hold on just a second, Richard.
Uh-oh.
Nicky, this is a trivial question, but were weapons ever distributed there to farmers in Kentucky during the Black Patch, the so-called Black Patch War?
They probably wouldn't have gone to farmers, but some of the state guardsmen that were involved in that, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, and there are some records of them loaning guns to local Frankfort people to shoot varmints and stuff like that. Pretty casual.
Anyone else? Okay.
This might be silly, but years ago when we had the cave off of Home Street, I don't know if my great uncle told me that there was gunpowder stored in there. Is that true or not?
And where, in the cave? No.
Okay. I didn't
No.
know what it's for. Powell was born in 1900, so it's just always the story he told us, so I didn't know.
Mr. Hatter can probably go at great length on that one. The cave was built for the brewery. Is that correct?
Here you go. Do you want to talk about it?
I'm sorry, but I didn't understand the question or what the topic is.
My great uncle thought the cave stored gunpowder for Frankfort.
You're talking about the Cave Restaurant, the end of Ann Street? Actually, I don't know.
He was born in 1900, that's what he was always told. So he told us the story.
I think it was just for the brewery, because they had their own bunker up in the cemetery. Anyway.
Okay. Anyone else? Lada, do you have a question, Lada? All right. Here you go.
Is it true that the Confederates only held Frankfort for 1 month during the Civil War?
Oh, what was it? Richard, 6 weeks, wasn't it? It wasn't very long. Yeah. 1862. Yeah.
Russ says it was about a month.
September 4th to October 9th, 1862.
All right. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you again, Nikki. If we'll give him another round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to let John remind you of our next event here. We hope you'll come back out and see us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. I really appreciate it. And just want to remind everybody, our next lecture is March 13th, at 6 o'clock, and that is Dr. Patrick Lewis with the Filson. So thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.